We're spending the next 2 weeks on what we often call the 60s. This week in particular will focus on the Black freedom struggle. You're reading March Book 3 and viewing 2 short excerpts from a documentary called The Black Power Mixtape. We've already seen pieces of the long Black freedom struggle since we started this class, with activists like Ida B. Wells and W.E.B. Du Bois in the late 1800s, but more recently with James Thompson pushing for the Double V campaign and the Myers family trying to desegregate Levittown, Pennsylvania. Civil rights organizations began to take up a new strategy under the Cold War. Now there are claims that racism and segregation harmed the U.S. image in the international arena and thus assist Soviet expansion overseas. So if you think about the language that we've looked at over the last couple of weeks around the Cold War, the United States is trying to argue that it's offering freedom while the Soviet Union is offering sort of the opposite of that. And that's really hard to reconcile with what was happening in the United States for many of its citizens. So Truman begins to support African American civil rights in unprecedented ways, claiming that, again, this will improve U.S. image overseas. Law enforcement slowly began to prosecute lynchings, and in 1952, for the first time in 70 years, there were no lynchings in the United States. Major League Baseball began to integrate, and Jackie Robinson wins Rookie of the Year award, and Truman desegregated the military by executive order. The Korean War was the first war to be integrated since the American Revolution. In addition to the ruling of Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, there were 3 events in the 1950s that pushed the Black freedom struggle into the mainstream. The first is the murder of Emmett Till in 1955. That summer, Emmett Till, a kid from Chicago, traveled to rural Mississippi to visit his relatives. A white woman grocery store clerk accused him of flirting with her, and her husband and brother-in-law hunted Till down at his uncle's house, kidnapped him, viciously beat him, and cut out one of his eyes, before finally killing him and dumping his body in a river. In the South, murders like Till's were common. However, because he was from Chicago, Black newspapers, first in Chicago and then nationwide, picked up the story. His funeral was a massive event, including thousands of people. Emmett Till's mother decided to have an open casket funeral, and pictures of his body made the front cover of several local and national magazines and newspapers. And so, again, these images were seen not just in the United States, but internationally, and certainly shaped the way that people around the world were thinking about the American justice system. Partially because prominent Illinois politicians intervened, the 2 murderers were put on trial, and it was covered by national media. But though they confessed to kidnapping Till, the all-white jury deliberated very little before finding the 2 men not guilty on all charges. They then sold the exclusive scoop, including a murder confession, to a national magazine for several $1,000s. There was no justice for Emmett Till. However, Rosa Parks later said that Till was on her mind just a couple of months later for the Montgomery bus boycott. After several attempts to establish a catalyzing case, Rosa Parks was arrested on December 1st, 1955, launching a citywide boycott of Montgomery, Alabama's segregated buses. This was not a spontaneous event. Many, many other people had experienced the same kind of thing, refusing to move, getting arrested. We saw at the beginning of the semester Ida B. Wells engaging in the same kind of civil disobedience. You might have sort of heard the story of Rosa Parks was just tired that day, but in fact this was really deliberate. She was a trained activist. She was the secretary of the Montgomery branch of the NAACP. And after Parks' arrest, a local activist group called the Women's Political Council called for a bus boycott. Several local civil rights leaders, including ministers, gathered to begin planning it. They selected as head organizer a then unknown 26-year-old minister named Martin Luther King Jr. The boycott was complicated and difficult. To keep the buses empty, civil rights activists had to organize carpools and walking escorts for over a year. So think about that. Consider how difficult it would be to organize a bus boycott just for your school, let alone an entire city. Additionally, white supremacists frequently attacked people as they walked. This led to national news coverage, which meant that national civil rights groups sent money and organizers to Montgomery, as did white supremacist groups. After 385 days, many arrests, and the bombing of Dr. King's house, the Browder versus Gale decision ruled that Montgomery's segregated bus policy violated the 14th Amendment. And the third event was the desegregation of Little Rock High School in 1957. So you want to keep in mind that in 1954, the Brown versus Board of Education decision had ruled that segregated schools were unconstitutional. So this is 3 years later. So just as we saw with the Reconstruction Amendments, laws and the Constitution aren't necessarily enforced, and they can, particularly in the Brown case, took a really long time. And so there were these desegregation cases happening all over the South. And perhaps most famously, in 1957, 9 black teenagers enrolled in the all-white high school in Little Rock, Arkansas. But when they showed up at the school, they were blocked from entering. The governor of Arkansas had ordered the Arkansas National Guard, so men with machine guns, to keep them out of the school. Additionally, an angry white supremacist mob also showed up to yell death threats and racial slurs. It is the President of the United States' job to enforce federal law, so President Dwight Eisenhower called up the governor and begged him to withdraw the National Guard, which he did. But when the 9 students tried to go into the school, the angry mob was still there, and they meant the death threats. And so rather than allow these students to be killed on national TV, President Eisenhower sent the 101st Airborne Division of the U.S. Army, complete with jeeps, trucks, and guns, to escort them to class. And for the rest of the school year, each of those 9 students had a personal bodyguard with a rifle escorting them to class. And in the end, the first black student graduated from Little Rock Central High School. But the story doesn't end there. This is shocking, but the next year, the governor of Arkansas closed the public schools altogether. Like other mayors and governors in states like Virginia, Mississippi, North Carolina, and Florida, he decided rather than have desegregated schools, his state would just stop having public schools altogether. Additionally, in 1956, Southern congressmen issued a manifesto calling for massive resistance to efforts to end segregation. They made the NAACP an illegal organization, they closed public schools, and they offered white children funds to attend private schools, which were, of course, denied to African American children, and they began flying the Confederate battle flag at many state capitals or incorporating it into the state flag. Additionally, you can see here, within the context of the Cold War, the FBI and others repress activists and organizations like Dr. King, and you can see this red baiting here, calling Dr. King a communist, which was very effective at the time. While this repression was often quite violent and disturbing, the events of the 1950s demonstrated to civil rights activists that the federal government could be pressured to enforce its own laws. Events like the Brown and Board of Education case, the murder of Emmett Till, the Montgomery bus boycott, and the Little Rock crisis brought worldwide attention to America's race conflict. And by the 1960s, the civil rights movement was firmly entrenched in mainstream America, with the sit-ins and the freedom rides. And the pillars of Jim Crow that we talked about at the beginning of the semester begin to crumble. It's easy to imagine that the civil rights movement, which seems so obviously righteous and non-controversial today, was supported by most Americans. But I encourage you to pause the video to look at the results of the surveys here of white Americans' opinions on the freedom rides, the sit-ins, the March on Washington, and the general civil rights movement. It's really clear that this was not supported by most white Americans. And I hope that you enjoy reading March this week. If you're interested in the full trilogy, the Bell Library and many public libraries have their full collection. So I hope you enjoy this week, and I hope that I will see some of you on Zoom later on Thursday.